This is 82-year-old Tony Knott, a father, a husband, a man with a love of trout fishing and his family.
Dad fell through the cracks in a broken system. Yeah, he wasn't someone who was ready to die or waiting to die. He was, 2 days prior he'd been playing croquet, the following day he was due to go trout fishing with his nephews. Yeah, I'm 100% convinced that his death was preventable that day.
It was 2021 when Tony went to North Shore Hospital's emergency department after injuring his leg at home. He arrived there at 11:30 a.m. How was that day for you?
Oh, it was the worst day of my life, I'd say, probably. Yeah, have no idea anywhere along the day how it was going to end. Just thought it was a procedure we were going through and that eventually Tony would be admitted to a bed in the hospital and within a few days he'd be home.
Tony never made it home that day. At 2:30 p.m, specialists at North Shore determined the hematoma on his leg needed plastic surgery at Middlemore Hospital and a request for an ambulance transfer was made. However, it wasn't until 2 minutes past 7 that evening that the ambulance arrived to collect him, 4.5 hours after the transfer had been requested. That ambulance took 4.5 hours to collect him. Is that acceptable in your view?
No, not remotely. And that's a big part of why Dad ended up in the state that he did, because that lag for the ambulance, in that time he wasn't really under the care of either hospital.
He was then driven to Middlemore Hospital. By the time Tony arrived here, it was 7:56 p.m. The hospital's ED was severely overcrowded and in a code red, according to the coroner's report. He continued to wait, and as he did, his vital signs were never taken. Lynn was with her husband at Middlemore.
It just seemed impossibly chaotic and like there was no care, but he was one amongst loads and loads of people in the same situation, seemingly the same situation, yeah.
So it was just total overload at the hospital?
Absolutely, totally, yes.
A lot of people there?
A lot of people, yeah, and no sign of anyone acknowledging his existence, particularly above anybody else's, which I think we just accepted, you know, still no idea there was going to be a terrible outcome to what was going on.
Absolutely chocker, and I believe that in the same hour that Dad arrived by ambulance, that 28 other people had arrived in that hour, and 50 odd had arrived in a 2-hour period between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. So it was completely overrun and in what I think they call a code red or something situation. The big gap there is that I don't think anyone even visually glanced at him, let alone took a blood pressure or an oxygen saturation or a pulse rate or anything like that. And by that point, Dad was looking extremely unwell. He was, according to my brother, as white as a sheet. My brother's not a medical person, but he did say that Dad looked like the sickest person sitting in the waiting room.
By 9 p.m, Tony, who had been sitting in the overcrowded waiting room with an oozing leg injury, needed to use the bathroom.
When he got to the toilet, Mum wheeled him in, and as he stood up, he said, "Oh, I feel dizzy." And he fell to his knees, and then he said to Mum, "Oh, my knees." And then he just collapsed, and basically he died right there.
It was just devastating. Though he was collapsed, he was actually, I was supporting his body, and the first person, I managed to reach the handle of the toilet door and ask one of the other patients would they get me some help. And I had the first person who arrived said, "Don't move your knees, you're supporting his weight there," and until they could get enough people to lower him to the ground, I just had to stand there with supporting his weight on my legs. It was very, very difficult and very sad, horrible place to be and horrible situation to be in.
By 10:15 p.m. that night, after an hour of resuscitation efforts, Tony was pronounced dead. Tony had hypertensive heart disease, a condition the coroner ruled was the cause of death. However, in the coroner's report, a pathologist noted that his leg injury would have decreased overall cardiac circulation, which may have exacerbated the underlying cardiac disease. The report also states that the delay of the ambulance at North Shore Hospital and the subsequent delay in assessment at Middlemore Hospital are relevant to the circumstances of his death.
But the burden of that day, of the bleeding, of the sitting around waiting, getting dehydrated, the medications that he'd taken that morning, the medications that he was on, they all meant that he had become extremely vulnerable and susceptible to changes in his circulation. And yeah, his body just couldn't cope with the loss of circulating blood volume, basically.
Rachel, who was a nurse for 30 years, wishes she'd been with her dad at ED sooner.
I will forever regret not being there that day to advocate for him.
Because he was let down.
He fell through the cracks for sure.
Do you think Tony might have still been around today had the situation played out?
He would have. He would have
better?
just, yes, I think he would have had some more years, and I wouldn't have probably moved to a retirement village. I would probably be living with him in our home. I don't think he'd have died if he'd had proper attention that day. The stress of all those hours of neglect that caused it, yeah.
Does that amount to substandard care?
Well, yes, without blaming anyone for it, yes, I think this whole system needs a good shake-up so these things don't happen to people, you know.
The Herald is waiting on a response from Health New Zealand about Tony Knott's care, but commenting generally, management at Middlemore Hospital have told the Herald the emergency department has recently been experiencing higher than expected demand, and that patients are prioritised based on their clinical risk and acuity, rather than by order of presentation.
Do you have confidence the situation now is better than it was in 2021?
No, nothing to suggest that at all. I think it's possibly even worse.
What's the state at the moment of the health system in New Zealand from a confidence perspective, if you like?
Well, from the confidence of one family, it's collapsed completely, but I know there's still a lot of good work being done out there, of course, but no, there's something very wrong with the system and it should be fixed. It should be a priority.
You used to know that if you called an ambulance, it would be there in a timely manner. If you turned up at ED, you were in the safest place you could possibly be. And it felt like a safety net, you know, and it is there in a lot of instances. Plenty of people get exactly what they need, but there are those who don't, and that is not fair on anybody.
Lynn and Rachel are now considering laying a formal complaint with the Health and Disability Commissioner, in the hope no other family endures what they did that day in April 2021.
He was kind of the heart and soul of our family. He was, he cared about every single person he ever met.
He was a warm, loving person, and yeah, we all miss him very much. Our children miss him terribly, yeah, and I do.